I'm pleased to rise in the House today to speak to and support Bill C-386, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code replacement workers. This issue truly strikes close to home for me in the wake of the prolonged Valienco strike in Sudbury, which was finally settled this past July, and to the strikers currently on the picket line in Voisey's Bay. During this protracted strike, nearly a year long in Sudbury, the hardship caused by a strike of this magnitude could be seen everywhere, not only on those workers directly affected by the strike, but by their families and the community as a whole. Not only were the livelihoods of the individual workers at Valienco severely affected, but the observable economic spin-off effects felt throughout the larger community were almost as severe. On a near daily basis, I heard stories from striking workers who were facing tough economic times and even tougher decisions about where they could cut back on necessities in order to ensure that their mortgage, utilities, and other household expenses were paid on time. The fact that Valienco was able to fill the labour void which the strike created with the use of temporary or scab workers served only to make the situation that much more dire for the workers on the picket line, as well as their families and their dependents. Madam Speaker, you may ask yourself how C-386 would serve to lessen the impact on the lives of striking workers, their families, and the community as a whole. Well, provincial legislation banning the use of scabs during labour disputes paints an interesting picture. For instance, Quebec was the first province to enact the ban on replacement workers in 1977. In the year prior to the ban, the average number of working days lost through an individual labour dispute was 39.4. In 1979, after the act was passed, the average was 32.8 days. In 2001, it was 27.4 days. Therefore, the enactment of similar legislation in the province of Quebec has led to an average decrease in the length of strikes by 12 days. Looking at aggregate numbers, the picture is even more impressive. In 1976, the year prior to the adoption of the anti-scab laws in Quebec, 6.4 million worker days were lost to strikes. In 1977, the number of days lost dropped to 1.2 million. This clearly demonstrates that banning replacement workers helps to reduce the number of work days lost to labour disputes, which reduces the economic hardship felt not only by striking workers and their families, but also the broader community. This is because a reduction in the length of strikes leads to a tangible reduction in the economic spin-off effects which a strike can have on a community. And Quebec is not the only province where anti-scab legislation is in effect. British Columbia passed a similar law in 1993 which had the effect of reducing strike days to levels comparable to those in Quebec. It also resulted in a 50% drop in the ratio of time lost. Ontario, too, adopted anti-scab legislation, albeit too briefly. The NDP government enacted it in 1992, and the Mike Harris government repealed it immediately upon taking office. Nonetheless, even in that brief period, declines in work stoppages were evident in Ontario as well. In addition to the provincial examples of banning the use of replacement workers, evidence suggests that anti-scab legislation promotes civilized negotiations during labour disputes, strikes or lockouts, and reduces picket line violence and the social and psychological problems caused by the extraordinary stress of labour disputes. Banning replacement workers would diminish the resentment that employees feel upon returning to work and would foster a fair balance and greater transparency in the negotiations between employers and employees. Contrary to what some observers had predicted, the introduction of anti-scab legislation did not lead to the creation of strike-happy unions run by unreasonable and irrational negotiators, as some opponents of this legislation have claimed. One of the biggest fears of corporate employers has always been that a ban on replacement workers would render unions more militant and difficult at the bargaining table. However, there is little evidence to suggest that any relationship exists between jurisdictions using anti-scab legislation and increased wage demands or settlements. Madam Speaker, unions are not interested in negotiating an employer out of business. Economic conditions, rather than the presence of anti-scab laws, are what continue to dictate the tone and content of negotiated agreements. There already exists a provision in the Canada Labour Code that prohibits the use of replacement workers if they are used to undermine the union's representational capacity. That provision is enshrined in Section 94, 2.1 of the Code. Yet although the section sounds like it ought to be effective, in fact, it's a paper tiger. As long as the business keeps up the facade of continuing to bargain with the union, it allows employers to carry on business as usual with the help of scab labor. I believe it's fair to say that a situation similar to this was a defining feature of the protracted strike at Vale. Something clearly needs to be done to close this corporate loophole which allows companies to hire replacement workers at the expense of those who engaged in legitimate collective action. As my experience in working in the Great Riding of Sudbury suggests, the use of replacement workers can have detrimental effects on not only striking workers, but on the community as a whole. The interest of striking workers should not take a back seat to corporate interests who seek to undermine legitimate collective action in an attempt to improve the bottom line in lining their pockets with corporate bonuses. Corporate interests should not be exaggerating the need for the use of replacement workers when the evidence strongly suggests that the use of replacement workers serves only to prolong the duration of a strike. The statistics presented above demonstrate that a clear link exists between the existence of anti-scab legislation and the actual duration of a strike. The arguments which present the need for scab workers to maintain operational capacity are null and void. Therefore, Madam Speaker, I call on my colleagues in the House to support this valuable piece of legislation. Every time similar legislation has made its way to the House in the past, the New Democrats have been vocal supporters. This time is no different, and I hope that the honourable members sitting on both sides of the House come to their senses and begin to side with the interests of working and middle-class Canadians instead of large corporations. Parliament should be focused on the needs of hard-working Canadians, and the passage of anti-scab legislation will go a long way towards assuring ordinary, working and middle-class Canadians that their government actually cares about them in what for many has become a daily struggle just to make ends meet. Thank you, Madam Speaker.